I'm Dan Edmonds, and this is the Ford Bronco First Edition. What's the First Edition? Well, it's got the 35-inch tires and the Sasquatch package, the stabilizer bar disconnect from the Badlands, and a 2.7-liter EcoBoost twin-turbo engine. Of course, I want to look at the suspension, so I'm going to pull the wheels off and see what they've done. But before I do that, remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends, all the things. To the surprise of perhaps no one, we're not seeing a solid axle up here. We're seeing double wishbone independent suspension. Now there's a solid axle in the back, but not up here. Now is that a bad thing? Well, if you're into maximum articulation at any cost, yeah. But if you want good off-road performance, but also good on-road drivability, well, this is going to give you steering precision and ride comfort that a solid axle can't. And you know, this is the same setup that you'll see on a Toyota 4Runner. Independent in the front, solid axle in the back. So what about this suspension? Well, we're going to have a closer look here in a minute, but what it isn't is lifted straight off our Ford Ranger that we know so well. No, this is derived from the Ford Ranger Raptor, which is a generation ahead of our Ranger and is sold in Australia and other world markets, but not here. The Ranger Raptor's track width is wider than our Rangers, and it accommodates bigger tires, which is why it's here on the Bronco. So let's get in closer for a better look. This is kind of backwards from the Ford Ranger, which has an aluminum knuckle and steel upper and lower arms. This is the other way around. And of course, there's this big Bilstein coil-over damper with a remote reservoir we'll see a little bit later. And I got to tell you, that wheel and tire, when I took it off, pretty heavy. So I'm going to be interested to put that on the scale later. So this is a really nice aluminum piece. You can see how the shock absorber mounts to it using a bow tie and a couple of big heavy nuts here. And this is a steering stop. You can see this casting here interacts with this. There's one on the other side as well. Over here we have eccentrics. There's one at the back leg too, so you can dial in camber and caster adjustments. You know, doing it with two eccentrics like that is a little bit tricky. Usually it takes experience to do it quickly and efficiently. Interestingly, this knuckle here, even though it's made out of steel, isn't as heavy as it looks like it might be because there's not as much bulk here. You know, this is kind of hollowed out in here, so you got web strength here, but not a lot of thickness. And of course, it's hollow all the way up into the top in this upper part that goes to the upper arm. It's pretty easy to see that this remote reservoir is a piggyback style. It's got a passage through here into the main body of the shock, and there's extra oil and the gas chambers in here as well. But at the bottom and at the top, there's end stop progressive damping that makes it a little bit position sensitive out near the extremes of travel. So the upper arm is mounted pretty high. It's not what I would call a high mount upper arm because this ball joint isn't actually above the tire. The tire actually just barely covers it when it's installed. But still, it's not down inside the wheel. So, you know, having it up high like this gives you extra leverage in this distance to the lower ball joint so that there's less stress in this upper arm and in the upper ball joint. Also up here you can see the top of the bump stop. Bump stop is inside the shock absorber and spring assembly. You won't see one on the lower arm like you might see on some of the competition. Of course, this is the Bronco's big party trick, at least if you get a First Edition or a Badlands. Those two both have a disconnecting front stabilizer bar, and that's what we're looking at here. We're actually not seeing the disconnect mechanism, but we're seeing the arm, which would normally be just a bent piece of steel, but because they've made it with this disconnecting mechanism, they've decided to bolt it onto the end. And so this is splined in here, we can't see it. And then of course we have a short link that attaches to the lower arm directly. And you can push a button inside and disconnect this stabilizer bar in 4 high or 4 low at speeds 20 miles an hour and below. And if you go above that speed, it'll temporarily reconnect, and then slow down again, it'll remember your setting and disconnect again. So if you're on a trail that's right in that speed, it'll go on and off as necessary as you pass the threshold. The interesting thing is, though, because of the way this mechanism works in here, this bar can disconnect when it's fully twisted up. A Jeep Rubicon, you got to be parked flat. There can't be any twist in the bar. It's got to be unloaded. This one does not care at all. So what that means is if you misjudge a trail, or you think, oh, I can make this obstacle, and then you realize you need a little more flex, you can push the button while you're all twisted up, and then get another 120 points of RTI. I think that's what it works out to. For my money, pairing the stabilizer bar disconnect with Sasquatch, as they do on the first edition, really kind of waters down the benefit of this feature, because the Sasquatch tires require a restriction in travel so they don't rub the fenders. What you want is a Badlands, which has 33-inch tires, a lot more suspension travel, and the disconnect here. So that's the one that's going to flex the most and have the best articulation. And frankly, if you have a 2-door like this one, 33s are fine. When you have a 4-door, we can talk about 35s. So I've got the wheel turned full left. Well, almost full left. There's a little gap here. But the idea here is this makes contact with this so that the steering rack itself doesn't get to the end of travel. And so that's why these are like this. But really what we're here for is the motion ratio, right? So here's our outer ball joint, and here are our inner pivots, and this is where the shock absorber mounts. So if you look at that and eyeball, it's about 70% of the way out from the inner pivots. So there's a motion efficiency of 70% with respect to wheel motion. That's what the spring and shock will see, since they're one over the other. And this bolt back here is that bolt we saw from the stabilizer bar, and that looks like maybe 55 or 60%. So it's a little less efficient, but still pretty good. And those are the ratios you have to think about when you're sizing your springs, your stabilizer bars, or figuring out your damping and your shock absorber. The front brakes are pretty interesting. As you can see, the rotor isn't really that big in terms of diameter. The biggest wheels have a 17-inch diameter, and maybe there's an 18, but certainly not these Sasquatches. They're 17-inch. And there's smaller diameter wheels on the base models. And the caliper's pretty beefy. It's a dual piston sliding caliper, and there's a lot of thermal mass in this rotor. It's really thick and beefy. So the diameter's not big, but the caliper seems to have quite a bit of strength, and the rotor has quite a bit of heat capacity. Well, that's about it for the front. I'm going to put this tire back on here and move to the back. But before I do, I think I'm going to roll this thing across my scale, see how much it does weigh, this Sasquatch wheel and tire. Before we get started, there's a couple things to notice here. For one, this is a Goodyear Wrangler Territory MT, but of course Ford didn't want the word Wrangler on a Bronco, so they had Goodyear put their name on there twice, which I guess Goodyear wouldn't complain about too bad. Just extra branding for them. The size here is 315/70/17 LT. That works out to 35 inches. 34.6, I think, but close enough. The other thing to notice is this is a beadlock capable wheel. There are 10 bolts here, and there are kind of gaps in between them. I bet, like we've seen on the TRX beadlock wheel, there's probably extra holes under here when you remove this to install the regular beadlock ring, which is an accessory in most cases like this. This doesn't have beadlocking capability unless you take this off and substitute another ring. Let's get this show on the road. Running out of daylight, still have the rear to do. 87.5 pounds. Pretty darn heavy. So here we are at the business end of the Ford Bronco, the rear suspension. Yeah, this is a solid axle, a big beefy one at that, and it's held in place with 5 links. You can see the lower link here, the upper link's a little harder to see, but it's back there. And there's a panhard rod, and of course the coil over shock absorber, another Bilstein with a piggyback remote reservoir right here, a little guard on it so that the stones don't chip it up. And this spring here, you can see up at the top, it's got kind of a secondary rate. The coils are all collapsed here. That's so that when it's drooping, full articulation, that the spring stays seated. But when you're loaded on the ground, it's like this, and then it's just this rate here that you see. It's really hard to see both links at once, at least from the top here, but this is a pretty decent view. You can see the lower link here, and you can see the pivot point for the upper link. And it runs forward, obviously. Right here is a breather tube for the axle. It goes up pretty high to give it the fording. I think it's 30 inches or 32 inches of fording depth. But anyway, that's because we have this vent tube on the axle right there. As you can see, the upper link is quite a bit shorter than the lower one and cantilevered forward on a bracket away from the axle tube itself. The idea there is as the axle moves up and down, that the nose angle of the diff stays at a good orientation to the rest of the drive shaft. Also, this lower link is pretty low. Bracket hangs down. It would seem to be kind of vulnerable, but it isn't too bad, and it's actually about the same height off the ground as the gas tank skid plate on the other side. This right here is the 5th link in a 5-link suspension. It's the panhard bar or track rod. You can see it goes from this bracket here on the frame all the way to another bracket on the axle. And what this does is prevents the axle from moving sideways as it moves up and down, because the 4 links in the front just keep it in position fore and aft. This holds it in place laterally, and you want this really long so that there's no, it moves in an arc, and if it was really short, the axle would move left and right a little bit as it went up and down. But if it's as long as this, that won't really happen to any appreciable degree. Now there is one thing missing back here. Have you noticed it yet? No? Well, there's no stabilizer bar back here. The one in the front is disconnectable. The one in the rear isn't even here. So yeah, this does not have any articulation limit by a stabilizer bar because there isn't one. These are the rear brakes, and I gotta say they're beefier than the ones that I had on my 2-door JK Wrangler. It's a single piston caliper, sliding caliper on these 2 slide pins, but this is a ventilated rotor. It's not as big, kind of like we saw at the front, but it's got a lot of thermal mass here. And even though it looks like it's got a drum parking brake with this big shoe here, or this big hat here, that's not true. It's got an electric parking brake that's here on the back. So whether you like electronic parking brakes or not, well, there's a button in this vehicle. It does automatically release if you forget to take it off and put it into forward gear and give it a little gas, so at least there's that. Well, that about wraps up the suspension deep dive close look at the Ford Bronco suspension. This was a first edition with Sasquatch 35-inch tires and a stabilizer bar disconnect. And I gotta say, it all looks pretty slick. Will it outdo a Jeep Wrangler? Well, probably not in terms of articulation, because a solid axle is a solid axle, and this doesn't have one. But where I think this really shines is if you're cross-shopping a Toyota 4Runner, because a 4Runner is laid out with independent suspension like this, but the roof doesn't come off, the doors don't come off. This gives you the Jeep experience, but probably at a little bit nicer daily drive. And you know what? With the stabilizer bar disconnect and these huge tires, it's got lots and lots of clearance, way more than a 4Runner. So I think it slots in kind of in between, about halfway between those 2 vehicles. Anyway, that's my take after having a look at the suspension. Let me know what you think in the comments. Once again, this is Dan Edmonds saying thanks for watching.